"You're not clean enough to step foot in this neighborhood." Margaret Sloan, president of the HOA, in her light-colored suit, screamed in my face right in front of the fence she had erected between our properties. But what she didn't expect was that the gate would turn into a private toll booth, one she'd end up paying out of her own wallet to get through. When those in power build barriers to humiliate, I turn them into lessons. Arrogance comes with a price. What state are you in? And if you faced an HOA like this, would you endure it or strike back? The farm I live on has been a family legacy since my great-grandfather's time. It stretches across sun-drenched, wind-swept land, surrounded by gentle hills where wildflowers blanket everything in gold during spring, and where the summer sun burns so fiercely the earth itself cracks. For generations we have been bound to this land like flesh and blood, tending every inch of soil and every animal, treating it as a testament to the resilience our family built over time. The road leading to my house, a narrow dirt path cutting straight from the main gate through the field to the yard, was never just a private driveway. For decades it had been a shared path anyone in the area could. People here were used to it being part of daily life. Farmers herding cattle to the field, children bouncing on water buffaloes, neighbors passing through to exchange a few words. I grew up with that image, a road with no gate, no division, and no one had ever imagined the day it would be sealed off by a cold, metal fence. That morning, just as sunlight began piercing through the branches lining the road, I heard a strange noise, the sharp clash of metal, clanking, and the pounding of a hammer. It wasn't the kind of sound that belonged in a quiet countryside. I left my work in the cow barn, stepping outside with a heavy sense of dread. Right in front of me, exactly where the entrance to my home had always been, a metal fence had just gone up, jet black, perfectly aligned, fresh weld, still smoking. A shiny sign had been hastily mounted on it, blinding capital letters, HOA property, no trespassing. Froze, my hand falling limp by my side, feeling as if someone had slapped me across the face. Nothing like this had ever appeared here before. No one had ever dared to put up a barrier across the road, and certainly no one had ever dared to post a warning sign on what had always been the rightful path to my family's home. That sight made me feel like I was being cast out of the very place I was born and raised. For the first few seconds, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I thought maybe someone had put it up temporarily for some reason, but as I looked closer at the steel post driven deep into the soil, I knew this wasn't some quick. Every strand of taut wire, every shiny panel of chain link fencing wrapped tightly around the road had been installed with one clear purpose: keep me from entering my own home. I could hear the cows behind me, lowing in frustration. They were used to being led down that path every morning, and now, stopped in their track, bellowed with agitation. Their cries blended with the tight, rising pressure in my chest, a mirrored echo of the insults clearly on display. From a distance, I saw a figure approaching, Margaret Sloan. She wore a light-colored suit, walked with a straight back, slow but brimming with confidence, as if she were stepping onto a stage and I was merely the unwilling audience. Sunlight caught her meticulously styled hair, and her face radiated a cold, smug satisfaction. Each step crunched against the dry earth like a declaration. She was in control. I had known Margaret Sloan since the day she moved here, and I had heard many stories about how she ran the HOA like a small-time queen of the community. People called her the kind who never backed down, always wrapped in polished appearances to mask a pride that bordered on cruel. And today, as she stopped in front of the newly erected fence, I saw that nature of her for what it really was. She halted just a few steps from me, her eyes scanning the farm, gliding over the time-worn roof, the modest cow barn, then settling on me. Her smile curled upward, twisted, and was full of contempt. Her voice rang out, high and sharp, as if she weren't speaking to me but announcing to the whole sky, "This land looks messy. It would hold its value better under HOA management." That line struck like a punch to the face, not because she insulted my property, but because every word dripped with scorn, condescension, and with the scent of takeover. My throat tightened. Each breath felt heavy. I wanted to shout that this was my land, that no one had the right to put up a fence, that her version of value was nothing more than a mask for greed. But before I could say anything, my cow bellowed behind me, as if urging me to respond. The sound made Margaret glance back for a split second, but she quickly turned to face me again, crossing her arms over her chest, her eyes locked on mine with a burning challenge. "You want to enter your own house?" she said, emphasizing every word. "Ask for permission." Time froze. I could hear every beat of my pounding heart, the air around me thickening. Never in my life had anyone humiliated me so openly. A woman, cloaked in the authority of the HOA, stood at my doorstep and demanded that I ask for permission to walk down a road that had belonged to my family for generations. I looked at the iron fence, morning light bouncing off its surface, glaring like a mirror reflecting the truth. They had chosen to shut me out of this community. In that moment, I felt anger, pain, and shame all at once. But above all, I understood one thing. This was a declaration of war. That fence wasn't just meant to block my path. It was a symbol of ambition, of division, of the contempt Margaret wanted to force upon me. She had chosen to make that public, and from this moment on, I knew there was no way out except fight back. I stood there, looking her straight in the eye, saying nothing. I knew any word from me now would only feed her satisfaction. I let my silence become my answer, so she would see that I wasn't afraid, even as fury screamed inside me. Margaret squinted, as if trying to provoke me further, but then she turned away, leaving me face to face with the cold steel fence and the long, echoing cries of my cow behind me. I stood for a long time, staring at the newly built fence, my hand clenched so tightly it turned pale. I knew that from this day forward, I was stepping into a battle she had started, and in that battle, I wasn't just defending a path. I had to defend my pride and my right to stand firm on the land of my ancestors. Just a few days after the fence went up, I found a thick envelope in my mailbox. A red stamp with the HOA logo was clearly marked, and inside was a neatly typed violation notice. I skimmed it, and the first line sent blood rushing to my face. Violation: unauthorized use of community access road. Fine, $600 US. At the bottom was the bold, jagged signature of Margaret Sloan. I held the paper in my hand, feeling as though someone had pressed a heavy block of iron chest. $600 for walking the same path my generation, fine born out of arrogant lie. I couldn't let it stand. That very afternoon, I went to the HOA office. It was a brightly lit room with gleaming floors, expensive landscape paintings on the wall, and fresh flowers in glass vases at every corner. Everything was arranged to project the image of true authority, not a place for handling shared matters. I walked in, placed the notice flat on the long table, and forced my voice to stay calm, though every word weighed like stone. Explain this. What gives you the right to fine me for walking on my own land? Margaret sat at the far end of the table, relaxed, gently rotating a teacup, her eyes lifting toward me with a look of utter contempt. She didn't bother glancing at the paper. Instead, she leaned back and gave a cold, dismissive laugh. You should know your place, she said, her voice drawn out, every word syrupy but laced with venom. This HOA isn't made for people from lower tiers. You're tarnishing the image of this neighborhood. In that moment, I heard quiet laughter from the far end of the room. Two HOA board members sat cross-legged, staring at me like I had come begging. One of them tilted his head, half smiling. It takes money to meet the standard here. Outsiders only drag the value down. The short chuckle rang in my head like a hammer strike. I clenched my fist, kept my eyes locked on theirs. What standard? Who decides? You call this a community, but it's just a place where you trample over other people's right. Margaret set her teacup down, the clink of porcelain on wood sharp and dry. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing. You have a choice. Either stay quiet, pay the fine, and learn to adapt, or sell the land. We'll find someone more suitable. Those words hit the table like a blade, cold and bitter. She didn't want my money. She wanted submission. She wanted me to feel small under her power. I knew I was facing an uneven fight, but inside, another thought took hold. If I bowed now, there would be nothing left worth protecting tomorrow. As I turned and walked out of that office, I could feel the heat of eyes burning into my back with mockery and scorn. The road home that day felt endless. I passed the cold steel fence, past the shining rooftops of those who saw themselves as elite, and in my head, Margaret's voice echoed on repeat, you should know your place. That afternoon, as I led the cattle out to the field, a group of wealthy neighbors passed by. They stopped at the fence, glanced at me, then gave a dry laugh. One of the women among them threw out a line like she was spitting it in my face. It's hilarious, getting fined for stepping into your own home. Maybe you should put it up for sale. This place was never really meant for people like you. Her voice stretched, each word deliberately emphasized to make sure everyone around could hear it clearly. My blood boiled, but I didn't let myself fall into the trap of anger they had carefully laid out. I gripped the rope in my hand tighter and stared straight at the fence, as if carving a vow into it, that those laughing now wouldn't be laughing for long. In the echo of the cows bellowing, I heard something that sounded like a protest on my behalf, like the land itself shared in the offense. That night, I sat on the porch, looking out toward the old path. The moonlight cast itself over turning it into a long, endless shadow. I thought of my father, of the times he led me down that road and said, this is the lifeblood of the family. You must protect it at all costs. Now, that lifeblood had been tightened by another's hand, but inside me burned a new resolve. Margaret Sloan might think she had pushed me to the edge, but in truth, she had just handed me the reason to rise, the reason to fight back. I knew then this confrontation was no longer a private matter between her and me. It was the raw truth about how the HOA used power to suppress, how a community that claimed to be civilized could turn a blind eye to pride and discrimination. I would not sell the land. I would not walk away. Every fine they issued would only fuel my determination to turn it into evidence of abuse, and I swore the day would come when Margaret Sloan would have to answer to everyone, when it would no longer be her laughing in my face, but the entire community laughing at the arrogance finally exposed. I thought the baseless fines and mocking glances were the limit of what Margaret Sloan could throw at me, but I was wrong. She didn't stop at using paperwork and regulations as weapons. Margaret wanted to drown me in front of the entire neighborhood, to turn my presence into a disgrace for my family. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, just as I opened the barn door, I heard noise at the gate, the sharp beat of heels striking the ground, and Margaret's piercing voice through the misty air. I stepped outside, and the scene before me hit like a punch to the chest. Right at the gate stood Margaret in her usual light-colored suit, hands on her hip, flanked by two other HOA members, three of them like a cheap play putting on an act of authority. She pointed directly at, her voice loud and arrogant, clearly meant for the neighbors within earshot. You and your skin color are ruining this neighborhood. Remember, this is a place for people with class. Each word landed like a stone hurled to my face. I could endure her contempt behind closed doors. I could stay calm holding that violation notice. This, a blatant insult, shouted outside my own home, with others watching, made my blood boil. I heard my son behind me, his breath quick and unsteady. He gripped my hand tightly, his small fingers trembling, then whispered, his voice heavy with sorrow and rage, "What do they think we are, Dad?" I looked down at him, his eyes red but burning with young defiance. I knew if I stayed silent now, I would be teaching him that the right response to hate is submission, and that is something I would never accept. I turned back to face Margaret, keeping my voice slow and firm, as if carving the words into the ground. As long as I live here, you will watch me walk this land. In that moment, everything seemed to compress. The two men beside her chuckled, lips curled in a cheap, taunting smirk. Margaret tilted her head, her eyes cold and sharp, her smile twisted with disdain. She spoke like delivering a verdict. We'll see. Around here, I write the rules. That answer wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of war. I understood then that Margaret had no intention of backing off. She wanted to force me into a corner, to make me an example for anyone else who dared to defy HOA authority. She knew exactly where to strike. Race, background, and pride. My gaze locked on her. I wanted her to see I wasn't backing down, that I would not become the obedient puppet she could control. My son clung tighter to my shirt, his eyes fixed on Margaret with a mix of fear and hatred. That was the moment I knew. This fight wasn't just mine. It was for him, so he would not grow up carrying the weight of shame. She was still standing there, her voice carried out intentionally so that the surrounding houses could hear. You think this cheap little plot of land adds value to the neighborhood? You're dragging down the worth of all of us. People like you don't belong here, not now, not ever. Her words were like sharpened blade, cutting deep into my pride. I heard the sound of neighbors' doors creaking open, a few faces peeking out. Some shook their head, some smirked, others silent and watched. Margaret knew the audience was present. She was performing, and I was the character thrown on stage to be humiliated. I didn't respond with shouting. I didn't need to scream to prove I exist. I said it once, calm but unshakable, so that she, and everyone listening, would remember. This is my ancestors' land. I don't need anyone's permission to walk on it. And no matter how many rules you write, the truth remains. Can't erase me from this place. Margaret narrowed her eyes, sneered, then turned to the two others beside her. Write it down. He's openly defying the HOA. We'll show him what the law really means. The two nodded, their eyes lighting up with smug delight. I looked at them and understood. The contempt would escalate. They would use every tactic to push me out of the place where I was born. But inside me, fire was rising, fiercer and brighter than ever before. My son tugged on my sleeve, his voice still shaking, but I heard the question in it, the need for reassurance. You're not leaving, right, Dad? Tightened my grip on his hand, my eyes locked on the iron fence and Margaret's arrogant face. We're staying, and they will watch us stand tall, not bow. Margaret said nothing more. She just gave a cold laugh, turned her back and walked off, her heels hitting the dirt like a hammer striking in rhythm. The two men with her glanced back, those half smiles still stuck on their faces. I stood there, watching their figures disappear, hearing my son's breath grow steadier. I knew then that I had crossed a line. There was no room left for compromise, and no path left for retreat. When the gate closed behind Margaret, I took a long breath. Inside me, fury and resolve fused into one. She thought she wrote the law here, but I would show her. Some laws cannot be bent by fake power. If you witnessed a smug HOA hurling insults like this, would you stay silent or fight back? Leave a comment now. I spent the entire night sitting at the wooden table in the living room, a stack of dusty land documents lying out in front of me. The warm yellow light fell across faded papers aged by time. The scent of old paper mingling with wood brought back memories of nights spent with my father when he patiently showed me the property lines, the boundary markers driven into the ground since my grandfather's days, through each page, feeling as if I were digging through the family's own history. Survey maps, land use certificates, all of it laid bare under the confirming one undeniable truth. The road behind that fence lay entirely within our property, never had belonged to the HOA, and never. I tapped my finger against the old certificate, the quiet sound echoing in my chest like clarity. Margaret Sloan could scream that she wrote the rules here, could sneer while turning violation notices into weapons of humiliation. What she built, hollow. The law was not in her hands, and it certainly couldn't be twisted by arrogance. I read the words over and over, as if to carve them into my memory. I wasn't trespassing. I was the rightful owner of every inch of this land. On windy nights, I could still hear my father's voice. He used to sit in that old wooden chair, look toward the patch of land in front of the house, his gaze stern but warm. When they build a wall, he said, show them that every wall has a door. Don't fear the fence. Find a way to turn it into your own path. I hadn't fully understood those words at the time, thinking they were just lessons in patience. But now, standing before Margaret Sloan's cold steel barrier, I realized he had left me a map. The idea struck me. Not slowly, but like fire catching dry grass. If they had built that fence to turn me into an outsider, then I would turn that very fence into the place where they would pay the price. I pictured the HOA's shiny cars lining up at the gate. No more mocking laughter, no more insults, only trembling hands reaching for their wallet. A toll booth. It sounded absurd, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense in the most bitterly poetic way. I laughed to myself, not out of joy, but out of a mix of bitterness and resolve. Fine, I muttered. You want to come through, you'll pay for it. I repeated that line over and over, letting it settle in my bones, a guiding principle for everything that would come next. The following day, I began preparing. First, I double-checked every document to make sure that if the HOA dared to sue, I would have the legal foundation to fight back. I went to see a lawyer I had known since my days working far from home, laid out the entire situation, and handed him all the files. He read them, smiled, then nodded. You have full right. They were wrong to build that fence in the first place. If you want to set up a toll booth on your land, no one can stop you. His words were like a weapon placed firmly in my hand. I spent the afternoon studying the road. Sunlight poured over the iron fence, the glare so intense it looked like a military checkpoint. I walked back and forth, measuring each section, calculating where to place the sign, where to install the barrier. Passers-by stopped to look. Some shook their heads, others smirked, but no one could guess what I was planning. I looked back at them and thought silently, soon you will all be witnesses when Margaret Sloan is the one reaching into her wallet. That night, after my son had fallen asleep, I sat on the porch, eyes fixed on the gate. The moonlight fell across the fence, casting its shadow across the ground like a scar. I felt anger, but alongside it, a strange calm. I had a plan now, and it wasn't just to retaliate against Margaret. It was to show the whole community that arrogance will always have to bow to the truth. I pictured Margaret dressed in her pale-colored suit, driving up in her shiny SUV and stopping at a wooden sign carved in clear, bold letters, "Private Toll Road, $100 per entry." I would be standing there, not yelling, not insulting, holding out the card reader with a smile. That silence would hit harder than any insult, because she would know then that the power she clung to had crumbled into dust. Over the next few days, I got to work. I found wood for the sign, painted bold letters with a steady hand. I installed a steel barrier, heavy, solid, impossible to lift without I even secured a portable POS, ensuring every transaction would come with a proper receipt. I wanted everything to be legal, airtight, leaving Margaret no room to twist facts. While I worked, I felt the eyes of neighbors watching. A few stopped to ask questions. I just smiled, offering no explanation. I let them speculate, let the rumors drift toward Margaret like a breeze before the storm. I wanted her to feel the tension build, to stew in uncertainty, so when reality arrived, it would hit even harder. The final night before the toll booth went live, I sat with my son. He asked, "Dad, why are we putting up that sign?" I looked into his bright eyes and said, "To show them that our land isn't a place to be insulted or controlled. Anyone who wants to cross it needs to show respect." He sat quietly for a moment, then nodded, a faint smile on his face. I could tell he understood. This act of resistance wasn't just about revenge, it was about protecting our family's dignity. When everything was ready, I stepped out to the gate one last time under the night sky. The wind moved through the fence, the soft clinking of metal sounding like a challenge. I placed my hand on the barrier, felt the cold steel, and closed my eyes, replaying every insult Margaret had ever hurled. Each word she spat was a scar, and now toll booth would be my reply. I knew the real battle was just beginning, that more would come from the HOA, but I also knew that starting tomorrow, Margaret Sloan and her entire board would have to stop their cars directly at the sign and face one truth. They no longer stood above me. If they wanted to pass, they would have to pay. And that was only the beginning of the reversal. I chose a scorching hot day to begin installing the sign. The sun blazed down, heating the ground until it felt like it might split open, dry wind rolling in from the fields, carrying the scent of wilted grass and dusty soil, making each breath feel heavier. But I needed that harshness. It felt like a test of resolve. I dragged the wooden boards I had prepared to the entrance, carefully measured each space, and then assembled the frame. Sweat dripped and soaked through my shirt, but every hammer strike felt like a drumbeat urging me forward. When I picked up the brush and painted the first letters, something fierce lit up inside me, a mix of satisfaction and unresolved fury. Across the rough wooden board, the letters slowly appeared. Private Toll Road, $100 per entry. I painted slowly with a steady hand, each bold stroke meant to burn itself into the memory of anyone who passed. When the final letter dried under the sun, I stepped back and looked at the sign like it was a declaration. This wasn't a joke. This was my law, written on my land. Behind the wooden sign, I installed a steel barrier across the road. It was heavy. I had to use all my strength to lift, but when it clicked into place, the sound echoed like the closing of a vow. I mounted a small card reader, connected to a battery, and a spool of receipt paper. I wanted every transaction here to be legal and transparent, leaving Margaret Sloan no loophole to twist. When I tested it and heard the faint beep of the machine, I smiled. That was the sound of the HOA losing its grip on total control. Not long after, a few neighbors gathered, watching from a distance. They whispered, then one of them burst into laughter, his voice echoing with disdain. "This guy thinks he's somebody, like he can write laws in the middle of a neighborhood?" Another chimed in, "That sign won't matter. The HOA's gonna teach him a lesson." They stood there, watching me like I was a lunatic putting on a show. I heard every word but didn't respond. I kept tightening bolt, wiped the sweat from my brow, and checked the lock on the barrier one last time. When I finished, I turned to them, my gaze steady. I didn't say much, just one line, calm but heavy as iron. "Just wait. When they need to reach the lake out back, they won't be laughing." The group went silent for a moment. Then one of them cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. I knew they understood what I meant. The lake behind my farm wasn't just where we took the cattle to drink. It was the same water source the HOA had quietly taken advantage of for their event. Every outdoor party, every high-end gathering, all tied to that lake. And now, the only road leading to it belonged to me. Word about the sign and the barrier spread quickly across the neighborhood. Some mocked it, others questioned it, and a few just nodded quietly, without daring to speak aloud. I saw all kinds of eyes on me as I passed, some like blades, some tinged with reluctant respect, but I didn't care what they thought. The only thing that mattered was the moment Margaret Sloan would stand in front of my sign, stare at the words $100 per entry gleaming under the sun, and pull out her wallet. That night, after the work was done, I sat on the porch and looked at the newly raised sign. Moonlight poured down, making the white letters shine clearly. I recalled every insult Margaret had hurled at me, every look of contempt from those who thought themselves superior. Each one felt like a blade etched into my chest, but now I had a weapon, a form of retaliation, both legal and sharp. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to humiliate anyone. I just had to wait, because eventually they would have to stop their cars, face their own arrogance, and pay for it in cash. In the days that followed, I watched from the yard. Kids from the neighborhood passed by, pointing and giggling. A few men shook their heads, half pitying, half mocking. One even said loudly, "This guy's a joke," thinking a wooden sign can stand up to the HOA. I simply watched them walk past, calm inside. Their mockery was nothing more than dull arrows, unable to pierce through the armor of my resolve. One afternoon, while I was feeding the cows, a middle-aged man from the neighborhood walked up, his tone half mocking, half curious. "How long do you plan to keep up toll booth? The HOA won't let you get away with it." I set down the hay, turned to him, and replied simply, "It's not a game. Anyone who wants to pass will have to pay." He shrugged and stood back, but I saw it, flicker of concern in his eye. More and more, I began to understand something. Their mockery didn't come from the belief that I was wrong. It came from fear. Fear of someone finally standing up to Margaret Sloan. They had grown comfortable with bowing their head, and my defiance left them unsettled, even jealous. They laughed to hide their own unease. Margaret Sloan hadn't shown up yet, but I knew she had heard. I imagined her sitting in the HOA office, face tightening, hands hand gripping a teacup, eyes flashing with rage as someone reported my sign. She wouldn't sit still, I was certain, but that very anger would lead to her mistake, and I was ready to wait for it. Late at night, when everything was quiet, I sat by the fence. Wind swept through, and the wooden sign creaked softly in the dark, its white letters glowing under the moonlight. I sat there and breathed deep, grounding myself in the reality of where I stood now. I was no longer the man being pushed aside, staring helplessly at I had turned it into a tool, a weapon to strike back, and from this moment on, the joke would no longer be on me. It would be on Margaret Sloan and her entire HOA board. On the first day, the toll booth was complete. The atmosphere in the neighborhood was tight as a pulled wire. The whispers and mocking laughter from the past few days still lingered in the air, but I knew all of it would soon fall silent. I woke early, put on my old brown vest, the one that had seen me through many seasons of farmers' markets, held the POS machine in hand, and stood beside the oversized wooden sign. As the sun rose, its golden light swept across the letters, "Private Toll Road, $100 per entry," making them blaze. I stood tall, waiting. The sound of an engine echoed in the distance. The familiar growl of a black SUV I had seen drive into this neighborhood more times than I could count. I didn't need to guess who was inside. Dust kicked up as the vehicle rolled up to the gate, stopped cold in front of the steel barrier. I saw Margaret Sloan's face through the glass, sunlight reflecting off her tight expression, her lip pressed into a line. She lowered the window, eyes sharp as blades, scanning the sign before locking onto me. Her voice came through clenched. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I raised the POS machine, tone calm but loud enough for every onlooker scattered nearby to hear clearly. "Please pay the fee." A few phones were already raised, cameras pointed in our direction. The residents were all too familiar with Margaret's dramatic, and they knew today was a show they didn't want to miss. Margaret flushed, eyes blazing. She flung the car door open and stepped out, heels slamming into the ground like she wanted to crush the dirt beneath her. Her voice cracked like a whip. "You're not allowed to do this. This is HOA property. You're just causing trouble." I held my gaze steady, voice firm and even, each word landing hard. "This is my land. Your rules don't cross this fence." The reply hit like an explosion. I heard murmurs swell among those filming. A few chuckles escaped and then whispers. "Listen to that." First time anyone's spoken to Sloan like that. Margaret looked around and realized every eye was on her. Every move, every word was being recorded. Her usual arrogance wavered for a second, placed by visible rage. "You think you'll beat me?" she snapped, still trying to stand tall, but I saw her white-knuckled grip on her handbag, fingers tight tension. I didn't move. The POS machine stayed out. She turned to the two others who had come with her, fellow HOA board members, eyes darting between command and desperation. One of them hesitated, then pulled out a card, trying to bypass the rule by paying in her place. I stopped, voice cold. "The person using the road is the one who paid. No exception." The murmurs grew louder, small bursts of laughter breaking out among the crowd. Margaret was cornered. At last, she pulled out her wallet, hands trembling. Though she tried to keep her expression hard, she swiped the card. The machine beeped, clear, sharp. The receipt rolled out. I tore it and handed it to her. "Thank you for supporting the farm," I said, faint smile crossing my lip. In that moment, the entire neighborhood nearly erupted. Cheers, clapping, and laughter spilled out, impossible to suppress. Someone shouted, "Sloan had to pay at the very place she controls." The line was repeated again and again, becoming a refrain, a running joke that swept through the community. Phones had captured every second of her pulling out her wallet, and the videos quickly made their way into resident group chats and even onto social media. Margaret's face turned pale, her hand crumpling the receipt with a clenched grip, but she had no choice but to swallow her fury. She spun around, climbed back into the SUV, slammed the door, and the engine roared with rage. The vehicle tore off, kicking up a long trail of dust behind it, but the image of her paying the toll had already burned itself into everyone's mind. No one saw Margaret as a symbol of power anymore, only as someone who had just been publicly slapped across the face. I turned and walked back inside, a wave of emotion rising in my chest. It wasn't the joy of petty victory, but a relief, like a heavy stone had been lifted from me. I thought of my son, of the tears in his eyes when he once heard those insults. Now, he would see the woman who humiliated us forced to bow her head and pay. That was the lesson he needed. That arrogance never triumphs over truth. That afternoon, my phone buzzed nonstop with messages, videos, and recordings sent from all over the neighborhood. neighborhood. They had captured every detail, Margaret arguing, me holding out the POS machine, the unmistakable beep echoing loud and clear. Some residents sent congratulations, even those who had never dared to take my side before. They didn't say it publicly, but I knew they felt a sense of satisfaction. Margaret, on the other hand, was furious. I heard she called an emergency meeting at the HOA office that very evening, her face flushed, slamming a folder onto the table and shouting that I had humiliated her. But all that rage couldn't change the fact. The truth was, for the first time in years, Margaret Sloan had been forced to pay, right in front of everyone. In the following days, the video spread wider. City forums picked it up and comments poured in. No one cared about my name. They just called me farmer who built a toll booth to take down the HOA. My story became a topic of discussion, and in all of it, Margaret Sloan became the punchline. I read through a few of the comments and saw people writing, "Feels good to see an abuser of power finally brought down." Someone else said, "That's karma. Build a fence for others, and you end up trapped behind your own." I closed the phone and smiled, not because I sought fame, but because I knew the lesson had been delivered. That evening, my son sat beside me, his eyes shining. He whispered, "You won, Dad." I placed a hand on his shoulder gently. "This isn't the final victory. It's just the first step, to show them we're not so easily stepped on." Outside, the wind swept past the wooden sign, its white letters still glowing clearly in the night. I knew the battle with Margaret Sloan wasn't over. She would find ways to retaliate, throw out more schemes. That moment when she swiped her card, that moment when her self-claimed authority was crushed by reality, had opened a new path. And on that path, I would walk until the day she bowed her head for good. Did it feel satisfying to see someone drunk on power, forced to pull out their wallet and lower their head? Tell me how it made you feel. The night Margaret Sloan was forced to swipe her card, I heard she immediately called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. Their office sat in a small building in the middle of the neighborhood, a place few had ever dared to question. Stepping into it felt like stepping into Sloan's personal domain. I wasn't at that meeting, but word spread so fast that by the next morning, the entire neighborhood practically knew every detail by heart. They said Margaret entered the room with her face height and drawn, her usually pristine hair in disarray, heels striking the floor like hammers. She slammed a folder onto the table, the sound sharp and violent, then shouted, "We cannot let a colored man humiliate us." The words dropped blade, raw, exposed, stripped of any civilized mask. It didn't just reveal her rage, it laid bare the deep contempt she had hidden all along. The room fell so silent, people claimed they could hear a pen drop. Some board members forced a smile, a few looked away, but one of them quietly pulled out a phone and hit record. Maybe that person had endured Margaret too long. Maybe, in that moment, even they, whatever the reason, the recording made its way onto the neighborhood. The next morning, when I opened my phone, message after message came pouring in. A neighbor had sent me the clip, less than a minute long. Margaret's voice came through the speaker, shrill and unfiltered. "Cannot let a colored man humiliate us." I listened. Each word rang out clean, undeniable, and I knew right then this moment changed everything. The entire neighborhood stirred. Before, many had tried to excuse Margaret's behavior, insisting it was just a land dispute or an argument over regulation. But once that sentence came out, there was no more room for denial. This wasn't about tolls or fences. This was blatant prejudice. Some were shocked, messaging in the group, "Did she really say that?" Others were furious. "We let a racist run this community for how long without realizing it?" And a few finally admitted they had heard that same tone in private meetings before, but no one had dared to call it out. That afternoon, as I led the cattle to the field, I heard murmurs from clusters of neighbors gathered along the roadside. They whispered about the recording, their faces a mix of surprise and unease. One man looked at me with an awkward expression like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the word. A middle-aged man, someone who rarely spoke to me, walked over and said quietly, "I heard the recording. Turns out she saw you as a threat all along." I nodded without replying, because I knew he wasn't the only one waking up from the shock. The news kept spreading, no longer confined to the resident. Some people downloaded the recording and shared it on social media. Within hours, hundreds of comments appeared. People were outraged, not just by the discriminatory remark, but by the fact that it came from someone entrusted with overseeing a community. "It's terrifying that people like this hold power," someone wrote. "That man was right. The land belongs to his family and she's just abusing her authority," another person commented. I didn't have to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. In silence, I simply told those who asked how I felt, "The wall has cracked. It only takes one push." That line spread nearly as fast as the recording itself. Some residents repeated it to one another, treating it as a prophecy for Margaret Sloan's fall. That night, I sat on the porch, looking out at the road where the toll sign now stood tall. Moonlight stretched across the barrier, making it shine like a blade. I thought about the shift shift taking place. Margaret Sloan had once arrogantly declared that the law here was hers to write, but now her own words had written the indictment. That recording was the first hammer strike, splitting the wall of power she had spent years building. The next day, a group of residents showed up at the HOA office. They weren't loud, but their eyes were sharp, questions relentless, leaving Margaret flustered. I heard she tried to deny it, claiming the audio was doctored. But the more she denied it, the more the anger grew. They asked, if it wasn't you, why does the voice sound exactly like you? If it's edited, why is the tone, cadence, perfect word for word? She couldn't give a clear answer, just blushed, hands trembling as she fumbled through papers on the desk. Those who had once stood by Margaret began stepping away. Few HOA board members even admitted publicly that they had heard similar remarks from her in previous meetings. The truth had always been there. Today, it was simply dragged into the light. And once that truth was exposed, no one had a reason left to defend her. I wasn't the one who made the recording, but I knew once it was released, the entire balance had shifted. I didn't need to shout, didn't need to declare anything. I only had to let the truth run its course. Just like my father once told me, every wall has a door. Margaret Sloan had fences, built rules, but she forgot that every word spoken could become a crack. And once the wall cracked, all it takes is a push, and it will collapse. That night, my son asked, Dad, so now do people believe us? I looked at him, placed my hand on his shoulder, and said, they don't need to believe. They only need to believe their own ear. Believe in the truth they'd heard, and the truth will lead. He nodded, his eyes lit with a new sense of conviction, no longer clouded by the doubt he had felt the day we were humiliated at the gate. The story didn't stay within the neighborhood. A few days later, a local reporter came to see me. She brought a copy of the audio recording and asked what I thought. I simply said, I don't want revenge. I just want my son to grow up in a place where skin color isn't used as an excuse for humiliation. That response was printed in the paper, along with the headline, Farmer Stands Up to Racist HOA. And from that moment, fire could no longer be put out. Margaret Sloan still tried to fight back. She sent notices to residents, denied everything, and accused me of inciting division. But every effort was meaningless. Once her true nature had been exposed, no excuse could hide it. Those who once followed her went silent. Some even came to apologize. I didn't need apology. I didn't need anyone to validate that I was right. The only thing I cared about was that the truth had come to light. And once it had, Margaret Sloan was no longer a symbol of power. She was just a name now tied to prejudice and abuse of authority. I knew this was only the turning point. The wall had cracked, but it hadn't fully collapsed. I still had more to push, had to make her see that arrogance couldn't hold forever. But when I remembered the flicker of fear in her eyes at the meeting, the tremble in her hands, I was certain of one thing. The day that wall falls isn't far off, and I will be standing there when it happens, not in anger, but in the calm of someone who knows justice has finally found its way. After Margaret Sloan's recording was leaked, the neighborhood no longer looked at her the same. Once seen as the embodiment of power and authority, she had become the symbol of prejudice. But I knew that if things stopped there, Margaret would still cling to power. She was never the kind to accept defeat. I needed a final blow, one she wouldn't recover from. One morning, I sat on the porch, looking through the gate at the old wooden sign. I thought about how Margaret still circled the neighborhood in her gleaming SUV, surrounded by her HOA clique, always looking at the world from above. I thought about the farmers in this area, the laborers with their calloused hands, driving old trucks, constantly side-eyed by the HOA, even stop times for not meeting some aesthetic standard. An idea struck, simple and brutal. I would raise the toll for HOA vehicles, open the gate for workers and farmers, free of charge. I got to work that very day. On the large wooden sign just below the line that read, Private Toll Road, $100 per entry, I added a bold new line. HOA vehicle, $200. Farmers and workers, free. Each letter was a dagger aimed at Margaret's pride. I knew that when she saw it, her face would turn. Not only would she have to pay double, but she'd be humiliated watching the people she had always looked down on pass through without. Word spread fast. The first day the new line appeared, the entire neighborhood lit up. People came to see, talking non-stop. Faces that had once been quiet now beamed. They whispered to one another, laughing as they read the sign. An old farmer passed by, read it, then burst out laughing and clapped me on the shoulder. You did what most of us only dared to imagine. I just nodded, but inside I felt something lift. That afternoon, the familiar sound of an engine approached. The HOA's polished SUV rolled in, tires slowing as they saw the lowered barrier. Eyes inside the vehicle locked onto the new sign, then turned to Margaret, and the driver's face turned ghostly pale, then flushed crimson. She flung open the door, stormed out, and pointed a trembling finger at the sign. You dare raise the toll for us and give it free to those filthy farmers? Her voice pitched high, cracking with rage. At that exact moment, a battered old truck creaked its way forward, bales of hay stacked in the back. The driver was an old man I knew well, sun-darkened skin, calloused hands. I signaled to him, lowered the barrier, and let him pass. The crowd around us burst into applause, laughter echoing in the air. The old man gave me a thumbs up and rolled on through, leaving Margaret Sloan and her shiny SUV behind, stuck at the gate like someone who no longer belonged. The applause grew louder, rising like waves. Margaret stood frozen, then screamed, her voice breaking in a fit of madness. "I will destroy you! You think you can humiliate me in front of this entire neighborhood?" I stepped forward and hung a small sign beside the main board, the lettering sharp and simple. Respect is free. Arrogance is expensive. When I finished, I turned to her, voice calm. "These are my rules. Anyone can pass through as long as they show respect. Arrogance, however, will cost." The crowd erupted in laughter, some whistling, others repeating the words on the sign like a slogan. Margaret tried to shout again, but the laugh drowned her out, turning her into a joke. A few residents even turned their backs and walked away, no longer afraid, pitying the absurdity of it all. Margaret's SUV remained stuck, while one beat-up truck after another, even a street vendor's cart, rolled through the gate without paying a cent. The rumble of old engines mixed with the clapping, forming a kind of victory anthem. I saw pride light up the faces of those workers. Once scorned by the HOA, they were now the ones welcomed with open arms. Margaret, shaking, returned to her car and slammed the door, but just before it shut, I heard her grit her teeth and mutter, "I will destroy you." The SUV roared off, tires kicking up a cloud of dust, but no one flinched. The neighbors just watched her drive away, then burst out laughing, still murmuring about the words on my sign. That night, the video of Margaret being stopped, yelling before a crowd while old truck cruised through without issue, flooded social media. People cut clips into different versions, added music, and caption. One went viral, just the words, "Respect free, arrogance is expensive." The internet lit up with laughter, and for the first time, Margaret Sloan's HOA became a public joke, not just within the neighborhood, but across the city. In my small house, I sat with my son playing the video. He watched closely, then burst out laughing. "Dad," she screamed like she lost her mind. I placed a hand on his shoulder and said slowly, "That wasn't just a scream. That was the sound of someone who's lost their power." He nodded, his eyes shining with conviction. In the following days, the effect only grew. Every laborer's truck that passed through drew nods of admiration from the neighbors. People began saying justice didn't come from the HOA office, but from the wooden sign at the edge of my farm. Some neighbors who had once kept their distance now came openly to shake my hand, telling me I had done what they never dared. As for Margaret, she sank deeper into rage and humiliation. Word spread that she called yet another emergency meeting. But this time, many chairs were empty. Several HOA members didn't show. They had seen the cracks in her wall of power and didn't want to be buried under it with her. I'm not someone who craves victory, but as I looked at the wooden sign with the words, "Respect is free, arrogance is expensive," glowing in the sunlight, I felt steady. This wasn't just a retaliation, it was a lesson for the whole community. That arrogance may build a fence, but it will also make you stop your car, bow your head, and pay the price. And in the laughter of my neighbors, I knew Margaret Sloan had lost, not to me, but to the truth, and to the weight of her own pride. After the decisive blow at the farm gate, I knew Margaret Sloan could no longer maintain the image she had carefully constructed all these years, but I didn't expect her downfall to come this fast. The video of Margaret yelling, being stopped at the toll sign, then watching working-class trucks pass by to loud applause, spread rapidly across online forums. People added music, overlaid the phrase, "Respect is free, arrogance is expensive" at the end, turning it into a slogan. At the same time, her racist audio clip resurfaced and was shared in parallel. Together they became a storm that completely buried her public image. The press got involved. A local paper ran a headline, "HOA President Accused of Racism, Residents Outraged." Soon, more reporters arrived in the neighborhood. They didn't go to Margaret first, but sought out everyday residents, the ones who had long lived under the HOA's control. And when the cameras turned to them, truths long suppressed poured out like a broken dam. A middle-aged woman stood in front of a camera, her voice shaky, firm. "I was fined $200 because my son left an old pair of shoes hanging outside. They said it made the neighborhood look bad." An elderly man recalled, "They made me repaint my entire fence because the color didn't meet aesthetic standards. I lost almost a month's wages just to please them." One testimony after another made the news, the broadcasts painting a vivid picture Margaret had worked so hard to keep hidden. The more people spoke, clearer the truth became. It wasn't just about unjust fine. Residents described the contempt Margaret held for low-income families. A young man said, "I drive an old pickup to work. The HOA sent me a letter telling me to park outside the neighborhood because my truck didn't the image. Margaret told me to my face that vehicles like mine lower property value." His words mirrored things I had witnessed myself, and now that they were being repeated in public, they were no longer isolated stories, but a collective indictment. When the press aired these interviews, public outrage only deepened. People began asking, what is the point of a homeowners association if it becomes a tool for oppressing its own community? And in every piece of criticism, Margaret Sloan's name was repeated as the person behind all the abuse. One morning, I stepped outside and found several reporters at my gate, asking for an interview. What do you think about Margaret's video going viral? One asked. Do you want revenge? I looked straight into the camera and answered slowly, I don't want revenge. I just want people to see the true face of the one who looked down on us. What she's getting now is the result of what she sowed. That line aired later that evening, and many shared it, calling it calm but sharp as a blade. Margaret was different. She scrambled to explain herself, sending out letters to every household claiming the audio had been doctored, that the video was staged to bring her down. But the residents no longer believed her, as they recalled the countless absurd fines they'd received, the condescending looks they'd once endured. They realized her excuses were nothing more than flimsy justification. Their trust in Margaret was shattered. An emergency town hall was held. This time, instead of the thunderous applause that once followed Margaret's every word, the room was filled with fury. One by one, people stood up to testify, to recount the damage, the frustration the HOA had caused. A woman choked back tears. I had to borrow money to pay the fine while she laughed in my face. Another man said, I stayed silent too long out of fear, but now I know silence only feeds injustice. Applause erupted, not for Margaret, but for the truth. Margaret sat in the front row, face pale, trying to hold on to a stiff, frozen smile. She spoke up a few times, but each attempt was drowned out by protest. The chair that once elevated her like royalty had become a seat surrounded by hundreds of angry eyes. Her reputation, built on fear, collapsed entirely. As I walked out of the hall that day, many came up to shake my hand. Someone whispered, it's thanks to you we finally stood up. I only nodded because I knew I hadn't fought for them. I had only cracked the wall so they could tear it down themselves. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind brushing against the wooden sign, remembering everything. From the moment that first fence was built, the insults at the gate, the ridiculous fine, to the moment Margaret swiped her card, all of it stacked like slices of truth, leading to today. And now, she had no power, no honor. Margaret Sloan had become a joke, a name tied to prejudice and failure. I knew the battle wasn't over, but I also knew the balance had shifted. I was no longer the man standing alone against the system. The whole community had seen the truth, and once the truth is exposed, no wall can hide behind it. That emergency town hall wasn't just an outlet for frustration, it became the clearest crack in the HOA's foundation. Those who once sat at the table with Margaret Sloan, who once backed her during every vote that harmed residents, now looked at one another uneasily. They understood the audio, the videos, and the flood of public accusations had exposed everything. If they continued to stand with Margaret, they would be swept away by the same storm. And for the first time in years, some of them dared to vote against. The air in the hall that day was, as ballots were handed out, hands that once trembled now rose with conviction. Each vote against Margaret dropped into the wooden box with a dull thud, but to her, it was the sound of nails being driven into the coffin of her power. The long-suppressed discontent now burst forth all at once, unstoppable. A long-standing HOA member spoke up bluntly. I've stayed silent too long, but I can't be complicit anymore. Mrs. Sloan no longer represents the interests of this community. His words stirred the room, followed by a round of applause. Firm, decisive, and unmistakable in its message. Change here to stay. I sat in the back row, quietly observing. No need to push to the front, no need to shout. Everything was unfolding exactly as truth demanded. Margaret tried to hold on, her eyes burning, her voice trembling, but still yelling, "This is betrayal! You've all been manipulated by an outsider." But the more she screamed, the more her voice cracked, the more desperation filled her eye. The crowd no longer feared her. The bowed heads of past placed by the bolds of those resolved simmering far. When the voting ended, the result was clear. The majority stood against Margaret Sloan. She froze, stunned by the reality unraveling before her. The HOA chair she had clung to for years, once untouchable, was now shaking under her. I watched, remembering the first day that the iron fence had been built at my farm's gate. Back then, she stood arms crossed, smirking, telling me I'd need permission to step onto my own land. Now, that same woman trembled, abandoned by allies, viewed by the community as someone who had dug her own grave. That afternoon, I returned home. My son ran to greet me. Eyes lit up. Dad, did they really vote against her? I nodded, gently ruffling his hair. They saw the truth, and when truth is revealed, no one can cling to falsehood forever. He smiled, but I could see the pride and relief in his heart. He had watched his father stand firm, and now the whole community was moving in the same direction. I paused at the gate, eyes drifting to the wooden sign that read, "Respect is free, arrogance is expensive." The evening breeze made it sway gently, as if whispering a reminder. I looked at the iron, once built to humiliate, now a symbol of Margaret's downfall. A single thought echoed in my mind. Those who build fences to shame others end up trapped behind them. I stood there for a long while, letting that thought settle, the natural conclusion to everything that had unfolded. This wasn't the result of one decisive strike, but of a chain of truths exposed, with Margaret's own arrogance turned against her. And more importantly, the residents had discovered the power they held once they stopped being silent. The battle may not be completely over, but for me, the greatest victory lies here. The wall of fear has collapsed, and from now on, Margaret Sloan will never be able to rebuild it. How long do you think an HOA like that can survive? Share your thoughts in the comments. Not long after that tense vote, the official announcement came. Margaret Sloan was forced to resign. The seat she had held firmly for years, the place where she once pointed fingers and issued orders, was no longer hers. There was no graceful farewell, no regrets from the community. She left the HOA office in silence, her head bowed, surrounded by cold stares. Her once powerful reputation had dissolved into smoke. Alongside her departure came another mandate. The HOA was ordered to make all financial records transparent. The baseless fines, the vague expenditures that had piled up for years were dragged into the light. Residents were granted the right to review and compare, and they realized just how long they had been taken advantage of. Murmurs filled the air, bitter nods passed between neighbors. There was anger, but also relief, because at least now, truth could no longer be hidden. As the news spread, I sat on the porch, quietly watching the road leading to the farm. The toll gate I had built had fulfilled its purpose. It wasn't just a wooden sign and a metal barrier. It was a symbol of resistance, a response that forced the arrogant to bow. But now, with Margaret dethroned and the community awakened, I knew the toll gate no longer needed to stand. One morning, I took the wooden sign down, each nail coming out with a dry crack. My son stood beside me and asked softly, "Are you really taking it down?" I nodded and smiled. "Because we don't need it to protect our dignity anymore. People have seen the truth." But I paused, pulling out the folder of land documents and handing it to him. "I'm signing over full legal ownership of this road, so no one dares touch it again." The deed was verified and sealed by the proper authority. I held it in my hand, heavy yet solid. Years of struggle, of insult, fences built and torn down had led to this. This land belongs to my family, protected by law, leaving no room for manipulation. That afternoon, I framed the deed in wood and placed it proudly in the living room. The sunlight caught the red stamp, making it glow. My son looked at it, eyes shining, as if he had finally seen undeniable proof of everything we'd been through. I placed my hand on his shoulder and said, "This is proof that we've held on to what mattered, not just for me, but for you, and for those who come after." That evening, a few neighbors stopped by. They were no longer the ones pointing fingers or scoffing. They came to shake hands to say thank you. One man spoke in a low voice. "You showed us that silence only feeds injustice. Now we finally believe we have the right to say no." I nodded, saying nothing more, because I knew the most important change wasn't in the gratitude. It was in the fact that they had learned how to stand. I stepped out to the gate, looking at the bare patch of land where the toll sign once stood. Now, the gate lay wide open. No more barrier, no more wooden board. Yet it carried a new meaning. It was no longer a symbol of division, proof of unity when people chose to face truth. And I knew, even if Margaret Sloan had vanished, this story would still be told, not as a joke, but as a reminder that arrogance always comes at a price. The day I took down the toll sign, many people from the neighborhood came by. They weren't loud like they had been when Margaret Sloan's car was stopped, but their eyes shone, as if they'd been waiting for this moment a long time. When the barrier came down, the air seemed lighter, as if a weight had lifted off everyone's shoulders. I wiped my hands and turned to see a gray-haired man walking up. He gripped my hand firmly and said, "You gave them the lesson they needed." Behind him came an elderly woman from next door, someone who rarely spoke, and yet today she stepped forward, her eyes glistening. "If it weren't for you, we'd still be living with our heads down. We're grateful." The handshakes kept coming, from people who once stayed silent, even laughed at me. Now they stood tall, looking me in the eye with respect, not because I had won a fight, but because I had proven that truth could bring arrogance to its knees. My son stood beside me, pride written all over his face. He had once trembled, asking, "What do they think we are, Dad?" And now he watched those same people reach for his father's hand. I rested my hand on his shoulder, so he would understand the greatest lesson wasn't about winning or losing, but about never backing backing down in the face of injustice. That evening, when everyone had gone home, I walked alone to the gate. In front of me was the empty stretch where the iron fence once stood to humiliate me, where the toll sign had become a symbol of resistance. I looked out at the road stretching far ahead and recalled every moment. Margaret's smug laughter as the fence went up, her shrill threats in front of the crowd, flushed face as she was forced to swipe her card. Now, it was all just memory, but it was a memory that would live on in the minds of this community. I closed this chapter with a reminder, not just for myself, but for anyone who hears this story. When those in power build a fence, make it the place where they pay the price. The words carried on the wind, simple yet heavy as stone. It wasn't personal satisfaction, it was a truth drawn from a fight between a farmer and a system that crowned itself with authority. I turned and walked back inside, leaving the open gate behind. And I knew, no matter how many more like Margaret Sloan may come, this lesson would remain so that anyone who remembers knows that the barriers of injustice will always become the place where their builders fall. At the end of this story, looking back on everything that happened, I realized this journey wasn't just a confrontation between me and Margaret Sloan. It was the awakening of an entire community. It began with a cold iron fence erected right at the entrance of my farm, where Margaret exposed exactly how an HOA leader could exploit authority to impose and humiliate. She thought that waving the banner of standards would make everyone bow their heads, but from that moment on, fire of resistance was lit. When the $600 fine appeared, when the insults about class and skin color were hurled in front of my son, I knew this was no longer just my problem. It was an affront to dignity, and if I stayed silent, it would become a dangerous example for the child growing up beside me. Step by step, I turned helplessness into action. The land records proved that the road belonged to my family, and from that, the idea of building a toll gate emerged. Counterstrike forced the arrogant to face the reality that their power only exists when others allow it. The moment Margaret Sloan was forced to swipe her card in front of the neighbors was a turning point. The image of her flushed face, her voice cracking with rage, flipped the entire balance of power. For the first time, the people saw the one who had imposed on them bow her head. Then came the leaked recording of her racist remark, and the wall Margaret had built for years cracked wide open. No one believed in her polished facade anymore. The final blow came when I doubled toll fee for the HOA while opening the gate farmers and laborers, drawing a clear line between arrogance and respect. From there, the community slowly changed. They began sharing stories of absurd fines, of the contemptuous glances they'd endured. Margaret's reputation didn't just falter, collapse. The vote against her was inevitable, and when she was forced to resign, no one felt a shred of regret. The name Margaret Sloan became a lesson in the downfall of someone who thought herself the center of everything. I took down the toll sign, not as a concession, but because its mission was complete. The road was legally certified as fully ours, with no loopholes left for anyone to touch. What stayed with me wasn't the laughter of satisfaction, but the firm handshakes from neighbors. They said I gave Margaret the lesson she deserved, but more deeply, they themselves had learned how to stand up. The son who once trembled, asking why we were looked down upon, now saw with his own eyes justice can be reclaimed, and dignity should never be up for trade. The lesson left by this story doesn't lie in the details of a toll gate, nor in the downfall of one individual. It lies in the truth that any barrier built from arrogance will one day be torn down. When a community stays silent, the abuser of power can grow unchecked, but when the truth is revealed and each person dares to speak, that wall will crumble on its own. Margaret Sloan didn't lose because I was better. She lost because she forgot that power only lasts when there is respect, and risk cannot be bought with money or enforced fear. As I close this chapter, I want to leave one simple reminder. Whenever someone builds a barrier to humiliate, turn that very barrier into the place where they must pay the price. That is not an act of revenge, but a way to protect justice and dignity. And from this story, I believe that those who have experienced injustice will better understand the power of refusing to bow, because justice, once awakened, has the strength to break through any wall.